Hello and welcome to Heroic Media. I'm Patrick Cordova.
And I'm Michelle Bauman.
Here at Heroic Media, we explore news headlines that deal with very foundational moral issues relating to family, marriage, and life.
Exactly, and those issues often tend to revolve around abortion, euthanasia, embryonic stem cell research, human cloning, and same-sex marriage.
Exactly. So what's our first story?
Thanks, Patrick. First for today, as bishops from around the world gathered in Rome for the recent Synod on the Family, many stressed that mercy must always be connected to truth.
Interesting. I think this is a good topic, especially with Pope Francis being the Pope that he is and kind of his charism and everything and how he speaks and interacts with people. Sometimes people get the impression, especially I think secular media, news outlets, and sometimes people that are just reading things out of context get the hint or they feel that what he's saying is that all of, I guess, moral teachings and doctrine and things like that don't matter in order to give mercy. But I think that by his actions and what he's done and what he said, he's certainly showing us a different way of interacting with people, but not at the cost of truth.
Absolutely, absolutely. They always go together. And I think we've seen that throughout this Synod over the last couple of weeks. Let's just give our viewers a little bit of an update on, or a little bit of a refresher on what a Synod is. So it's a meeting of bishops from around the world. They happen every couple of years. And both last year and this year, the bishops have been discussing family issues. So all kinds of challenges, everything from marriage prep classes to pornography, different challenges that that are part of married and family life.
Yeah.
And for a while, there's been kind of this push to try to make this all about communion for the divorced and remarried. And so we've seen kind of an emphasis on this, that some of the media and a couple of people at the Synod are saying, no, this is what this is all about. And there's kind of been a pushback against that by a lot of the bishops who are saying, okay, but when we address this, we always have to remember mercy and truth go together, that it's a false mercy if you just say, okay, we're going to change all the rules and let you do whatever you want. That's not what we see Christ doing. When we see Christ with the woman caught in adultery, he tells her, go and do not sin again. And so he forgives her, but then he actually calls her to live to a higher standard.
Mercy comes with a challenge, in other words.
Absolutely.
It wasn't that it was just mercy as in, I've forgiven you, there's no reparations that need to be made or anything like that. It's a challenge to go forward, living your life, without making those same sins, right? Without committing those same sins. And I think that it's interesting too, because that kind of ties into the whole justification of the doctrine of like purgatory and still having to basically pay for your sins, right? And so you can't just if you go break somebody's window, you can't just it's not like, oh, I'm sorry, I accidentally broke your window. No, you have to go fix the window. There's things that you have to do other than just simply being forgiven, right? And so it kind of goes, mercy and forgiveness go hand in hand, right? And so yeah, I think it's important to talk about this, and the Synod especially listens. You already laid out a whole bunch of things that they had to discuss, but they're really listening to the challenges of the family, especially as it relates to this time, right? There's so many challenges, redefining the family. What is a family, as we'll talk about later on this episode, and yeah, just addressing those directly, but not in a condemning way. And so I think that's where, in today's time, there are changes that need to be made, and they're difficult to be made. They're difficult changes to be made, but they have to be made. You have to address people in a merciful way, but one that still speaks the truth.
Right. Absolutely.
And so you don't just, it's hard to explain, but it's a difference between allowing your child, for instance, to do whatever they want to do and letting them roam free, but also setting proper boundaries with love, saying, hey, I wouldn't let my kid, eat candy all night because I know they're going to get sick.
Exactly.
Say, hey, the reason we're doing this, explaining it, but doing it in a loving way, not just saying, why are you doing this, blah, 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 getting mad. I think there's a tactful way of addressing.
Right, it's
mercy.
that balance, like you're saying. And I thought a couple of the quotes from some of the bishops at the Synod really sort of explained this well. One Synod participant said, mercy means giving people a challenge. It is not covering reality with gift wrap. So going back to that challenge that you mentioned. And another person said, the proclamation of the gospel and the embrace of God's mercy are two equally valid and intrinsically related aspects of life. So I think, we keep getting this idea that unless we recognize sin, then we can't have a proper understanding of who we are in relationship to Christ. So we can't ignore the reality of sin. We can't deny it. We can't pretend it's not there. We have to face it. We have to accept it. And we have to be willing to take the call to conversion to change our lives. And only then can we truly have this proper merciful relationship with Christ where we accept his forgiveness and his mercy and his challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of that comes with, meeting people where they are, because everybody's at a different stage in their life, at a different point where they are either receptive or not to that mercy too. And so how you interact with them and show them that mercy and share the love of God with them can make a big difference,
Absolutely.
how you do it.
That's important.
What's our next story?
Thanks, Patrick. In our next story, a New York Health Department form for new parents asks the woman giving birth if she is male or female.
Wait, so you're telling me that a male can give birth?
In New York, yes.
Only in New York, okay.
This is, just kind of a bizarre story.
Bizarre,
Sometimes we have bizarre stories on here. So this form that you fill out when you give birth in New York, it asks for the mother's birth date, legal name, social security number, and then it asks what her sex is. And the idea, the transgender advocacy groups are happy because this doesn't make assumptions about sex or gender of people parenting children. So, this gets rid of that silly assumption that women are the ones who give birth to children and that you have to be biologically female to have a womb, to become pregnant, and to give birth. So, there's just...
It's strange because usually they make the distinction. They don't want to basically address the word sex. They want to add a new word usually that says like your identity.
Gender identity.
Right? So this was interesting, I thought, just because of its bizarreness, but also because of the way that I thought that they would add a box and then that would be the thing that we would be talking about. But this one is, they said, what is your sex? And sex isn't something that you can define, right? As the way that they've created terms, gender identity, right? You can, that can be something, according to its definition, that you could define yourself. But sex is something that is defined by God, right? It's written in your genes. And so I think that it's interesting that they decided to make that definable despite what is true.
That's the thing, it's so disconnected from reality. If you look at your genes, the X and the Y chromosomes, if you look at just your body, your biology, you're either male or female. And so the idea that, we don't want to assume anything make assumptions about that, that's based on scientific reality. So when we get this disconnected from reality, we really have to take a step back and say, where is this coming from? And it's coming from this assumption that there is no truth. There is no moral truth. There's your truth and there's my truth. It's all relative. But this is not helping people. If you have someone come to you, if you have a child who comes to you and they say, Dad, I'm a dog, you can, okay, that's funny, but if they really start growing up and they really believe that they're a dog, you can't just entertain that thought. You have to get them help. You have to say, no, you're not. Right. That doesn't have any grounding in reality. And the bottom line is there is a reality here.
Yep.
And we have people who are not acknowledging that.
Yeah, and the further that we get from reality, I think the more confusing it gets. It's kind of hidden under this umbrella of, being inclusive. But I really think that, especially in this case, it probably is causing confusion more than being inclusive. People are like, huh? And I think that might be part of what, the agenda behind this is to, kind of bring awareness or whatever, or start to impose, how they see the world towards everybody else. And I think that most people are pretty logical and can understand that there is a difference between male and female, and that it's not something that you just decide, especially via a checkbox on how you happen to feel at that point in time, right? Because advocates of these types of beliefs they say that gender identity is fluid, and so that's what their defense was, is that somebody who is giving birth right now could consider themselves to be a male.
But then tomorrow they might consider themselves a female. So
exactly, and I think that that's why one of the reasons why it's so confusing. And you can trace it all the way back to the fall, right? We tend to let our emotions guide what is true instead of letting truth and truth be the measure. It's our emotions that are the measure. But our emotions can change on a whim. But we're so emotionally driven. New products and new things and new this and new that. How do I feel? What do I feel like? And so we've allowed that to expand all the way into our sexuality, which of course ties into the family and all sorts of different things. And so I guess all this started with the legalization of same-sex marriage also as their justification for why all of a sudden this was added on there. So there's a lot of complex things, and they all kind of touch on each other and interact with each other. But to me, it seems to be kind of confusing and flies in the face of what is obvious truth. So
absolutely,
like you said, people need a little bit of help with this rather than going along with it and redefining a checkbox.
I think so.
All right.
Coming up after the break, we'll discuss a woman who says she loves her boyfriend, she wants to be with him forever, but she doesn't want to get married.
Stay tuned.
Hello, and welcome back to Heroic Media. In case you're just joining us, I'm Michelle Bauman.
And I'm Patrick Cordova. In our next story, a Washington Post article titled, "I love my boyfriend, but I never want to get married," raises several questions about marriage and its purpose. So I think this article kind of relays the thought of how a lot of younger people feel today about marriage in general. And pretty much, I won't state, go through all the things that this woman talks about, but she pretty much just lays out her life and kind of where she's been and where she's at and why she doesn't really want to get married. And along the lines of that, it seems just based on her description of things, she's at a point in her life with her boyfriend where she feels like she's getting everything out of the relationship that she wants, and she doesn't feel like marriage would add anything to it. And based on her experience with marriage and what she has seen with others with marriage, it just doesn't seem like something that will last, because her parents have been divorced, her grandparents, her aunts and uncles. I mean, even the boyfriend that she would, for all intents and purposes, be marrying right now, it said to her on their first date, don't ever get married, because he had also been married and just recently divorced. So I think there's a lot of things that we could talk about in here. Where do you want to get started?
Absolutely. I think that's a good summary, Patrick. It's, you see that she is very serious about this guy. They've been dating for 4 years. They're living together. Yes. She said that they, have joint health insurance and they share bank passwords and they're trying to have a baby. So she's saying, look, we are in this for the long haul, but I don't want to get married. And I thought that she's had a couple quotes here that I thought were very revealing into her mindset. And I agree. I think there are a lot of people who think this way. So let's take a look at this. One thing she said, "Weddings and marriages can be beautiful, but I can't imagine signing on the dotted line making me feel any more committed to my partner than I already do." Now, I think the key word in that sentence is feel. She doesn't think that getting married would make her feel more commitment. It's not about how committed you feel, it's about how committed you are.
Yes.
Marriage is a commitment, marriage is a vow. It's where you stand up in front of God, in front of society, in front of your loved ones, and you say, I, right now, I'm making this commitment to be with you for the rest of my life, even when times get tough.
In sickness and in health, whether I feel good or feel bad.
Exactly.
Yeah, right.
So it's not about making you feel more committed. That is the point at which you make that commitment. And it sounds like what she's doing, what a lot of people do today, is sort of slide into it. You get close, you start dating, you move in together, and you have a kid together. But at what point, at what moment did you stand up in front of each other and in front of everyone else and say, I am making this choice, and when things get hard down the road, I'm going to stick by this choice? That's what it's about. That's what marriage is.
Yep, absolutely. And there's so much confusion about this too, because she actually mentions that she doesn't want to get married, whether civilly or holy marriage. She specified that too, which I thought was rather interesting, because she discredits the whole, hey, I'm going to get married to get specific benefits as well, which I thought was just like the entire thing. She's like, it shouldn't matter whether or not I sign a paper or do this or do that, whether it be civilly or in a church, that I should get certain benefits. And I think that kind of complicates these things a little bit, because just like you mentioned, holy matrimony, it's that between a man and a woman and God, right? And so there is something. I disagreed with one of the things, well, many of the things she said, but one of the things that I disagreed with is she said, being married doesn't magically make you a better parent, just as being unmarried doesn't mean you're lacking in the ability to take care of a child. And so That's true. I don't think it magically makes you better. But one thing that I would say about holy matrimony that might be seen as magical is that you do receive some special graces from God, right? Because of that vocation. And because that ceremony and that commitment was made before God, and with each other. And so I think that does change people. I think that a lot of people in the past, just based on divorce rates, have gone, against their vows, and they don't really take them seriously. And I think that is, we've talked about it before, the cause of a lot of the problems that we have with marriage. But it's difficult to fault her on some things just because of her poor experience with it, right? Like, you can understand where she's coming from. She's almost like in her article, she's talking about all this stuff, and she's almost wants somebody to say something that would give her a reason to go, that is a good reason to get married, or I see that, right? And so it's difficult, especially with all the examples and all that she has known through, I can't remember how old she was. I think she's in her 30s. In her 30s. And she's spent a considerable amount of time knowing nothing but marriage always ends in divorce. And there's no reason, to continue to go through with it. It's just a hassle.
And you can see in a society where we have prenups, where we have no-fault divorce, marriage doesn't seem permanent. It doesn't mean anything, and that's the underlying thing here. She doesn't understand what marriage means. She doesn't understand the true purpose. But ultimately, I think, there's one other quote that just struck me as really being indicative of where she's going wrong. She says that she doesn't want them to stay together because they promised the government or somebody else that they would. She wants them to stay together because they're just as in love, dedicated, and passionate about each other 30 years down the road.
And that's a big mistake.
And you know what? That's great, but what if that doesn't happen?
That's a fairy tale.
The idea that you're going to be just as in love and passionate 30 years from now, if you are, that's great, but I think in the majority of cases, you have to work at it.
You do.
And you know what? It comes and goes. The feeling of being in love comes and goes throughout your relationship. But if that's what you're basing your future on, what happens if you're not as in love and as passionate about him in the future? Are you going to leave him? You're not committing to it. And I just think, human beings are flawed, and there are going to be times where you get frustrated with your spouse, where you're annoyed, where you don't really want to do this anymore. And those vows that you made matter. Yeah,
they do, and they come into play, and they help you. And that grace that you received in sacramental matrimony helps out. It really does. Grace is something you have to accept, but in a sacramental marriage, it is given to you. So it is something that is a benefit that you would otherwise not have, right?
Absolutely.
Whether you accept it or not is a whole other question. But yeah, you're right. That I think that is a great reason. She obviously wants to be in something that's committed and that lasts forever and that is good for raising children. And I think that the biggest reason is that extra grace that you receive from God. There is something to be said about standing and making a commitment, but we've made, society has made a mockery of that.
Absolutely.
And so I can see how she, sees otherwise. But I still think that despite that, what other people have made of it, you still do receive something that you wouldn't otherwise, that could help make your relationship that much more beautiful and that much longer.
Absolutely. Right? And so I think it's important that we witness that, because there are so many people that don't realize that. They need to see these strong, healthy marriages that are based in Christ, and that's our job, is to go out and witness that.
Exactly. Being a witness, I think, is key, because that's how you change how other people view. If you don't act it out, then you can't just talk about it.
Right.
You have to act it out.
Right. Absolutely.
All right. In our next story, Meg, a young blogger who has dedicated her life to Christ, shares 8 ways to keep the Francis effect going. So this is, of course, in response to Pope Francis being here recently in the United States for the World Meeting of Families, and kind of her reflection. She's what's kind of known as a hobo for Christ. She's got a website, piercedhands.com, and that's where she posted this article. And she kind of gives these 8 reasons, or not 8 reasons rather, but 8 ways to keep the Francis effect going. So now that he's come, he's done all these things, he's spoken, he's met with people, he's done all these wonderful things. How can we take what he has done and showed while he is here and apply that to our lives every day?
Yeah, I think this is really important. We look at some of the things that she had are very simple. She said talk about it. While there's still kind of this buzz, this excitement, it gives you a really easy opportunity to talk about the faith. People are talking about how John Boehner was crying during the congressional address, how Pope Francis, turned down an invite to go to lunch with a bunch of dignitaries so he could go have lunch with the poor. It gives you an opportunity to talk about your faith.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what she said. She said, you could talk, because it's already in. It's not like you're bringing up a subject that somebody doesn't want to talk about. They're already talking about it and mentioning it. They're saying, did you see him crying last week? I've never seen a politician so sincere. Then you start talking about why he was crying, and you get onto the subject of, really what it leads you to is Jesus Christ, and you opening the door and the conversation about something deeper, right? So it's a conversation starter.
Right.
And so I think that was her number one, talk about it. And so I think that was good. I think that's a very valid point. The second one was lose the labels, right? And so we've talked about that before on here as well, probably even before the Pope, any of the talk about Pope Francis being here and stuff. But yeah, losing the labels. We are Catholic. We are not, yes, we are Democrats and Republicans, but our core of our identity should be Catholic, right? And so it should bridge all of those. And that's basically what she's saying. He didn't come here as a Republican or a Democrat, or he came here as a Catholic, the head of the Catholic Church, to show us how to live. So how does that apply to me and how I vote and how I associate with my party, right? She said Pope Francis is both very liberal and very conservative at the same time, right? Because of his Catholicity, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that carries through, a lot of the different things that he said while he was here. You kind of see that. And the same thing with her third point, agree with people. There was a lot of people a number of people who I know who said, why wasn't Francis more critical? Why didn't he criticize the U.S. more? Actually, if you look at the full body of his texts while he was here, he did do a fair amount of criticizing, but he always wants to encounter first. And then, he doesn't lead off by saying, here's what you're doing wrong, because who's going to listen to that?
Yeah,
and we look at Jesus with the woman caught in adultery. When did he actually tell her go and sin no more? It was after everyone else had left. That was in private. Yeah. So, I think we see that with Pope Francis a lot. And so, agree with people, find the common ground before you invite them and challenge them to go further.
Yeah, exactly. When he went and spoke in front of Congress, he wasn't like, you guys have done this, and why are you doing that? He said, hey, look at all this stuff. We've passed these laws for this, and done that, and he basically established some common ground and said, look at all this wonderful things that we've done, and then led into gently, what the future would look like, if we take, the path of truth. And so you're right. He didn't go in there guns blazing, so to speak, right? And that's kind of what our society craves these days. They want a conflict. They want tension. They want, this in-your-face thing, right? And so that's not really the best way to go about doing things.
Right. And then the next two are comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable.
Yeah, that was interesting.
That was interesting because she said usually we do the opposite. The people, we tell people who are in sin, let me tell you just how wrong you are, and sort of just attack them. And then the people who are kind of doing okay, we just kind of don't ever challenge them. And she said, no, you need to do the opposite. You need to reach out and help those people who are suffering, who are in sin, and help, bring them back in. And then the people who seem to be comfortable, give them a challenge, help them,
push them along in their faith.
Exactly.
Don't let them become complacent.
Exactly.
Right? And then the sixth, lead with love. And I feel like that kind of goes with the agree with people, right? When people feel loved, they want to get closer. They can't ignore it. And then when they get closer, they realize that it's not, Pope Francis or you that is talking to them so much as Jesus. They start to learn that Jesus is really the person that's calling. And that's how Christ works through us, right? And so I think that, leading with love, thinking about things about those people, saying, finding out what you love about them and sharing that with them, kind of opens the door, she says.
Exactly. And I think it's all about the encounter. And I think that's true of the last two as well. Keep your eyes and heart open, and then smile more. Yeah. And I think both of those are tied in with the encounter. You have to encounter people. You can't just preach at them or hit them over the head with a Bible. Encounter them. See them as a human being, a child of God with dignity, and then, talk to them, engage them.
There's all these wonderful things happening, right? People returning the sacraments after decades of not being there, after they saw Pope Francis on TV, or people in a bar where the entire bar is watching Pope Francis and they ended with a prayer, like these crazy things. And so he's just saying, open your eyes, see what's around you so that you can see people who are in need or want to discover more about Jesus so that you can help them be led to him.
Right, absolutely.
All right, stay tuned. We have one more story coming up after the break.
Welcome back to Heroic Media. In our final story, a professor teaching an experimental course at a Maryland prison says he has seen the profound impact of teaching the Bible to inmates.
Interesting. An experimental course. I think that what we can learn from this is that is really what we've talked about before on here, and especially that we see with Pope Francis, and that is how important that encounter is, right? Because as much as like we get sucked into technology or being on the internet or not interacting with another human being, I think that it's most powerful when we interact with another human being. And I think that that goes obviously for the gospel, right? I think that's the best way to spread the word is in person. And I think that's really what they're seeing in this interaction in this prison.
Right, and I thought this was interesting because it was difficult to tell if the author of this article in The Atlantic was specifically there with a religious purpose, because he didn't talk about saving souls or introducing these inmates to Jesus Christ. He had sort of more of an intellectual approach, and yet he still said that the Bible had this profound impact on these inmates, more so than other books that he taught. And I thought that the way that he delved into this was so interesting. He said that basically the Bible was forming their character, and even if they weren't Christian, even if they could never relate to religion as an institution, it just spoke so deeply to their humanity that it really was shaping them and forming them.
That's great. I think that we do have a longing to be like God, right? Because we were created in the image and likeness of God. And so I think it makes a lot of sense that when you're reading the Word of God, that it's going to be different than any other book that you're reading, right? And it will probably speak to you more than other things. I know it's like that with movies. For me, like sometimes movies, what's that? What's the one? The Mockingjay or whatever? Yeah,
Hunger Games.
Yeah, the Hunger Games. I was watching that one the other day, and I was just like, when I was watching it, all I could think about was like, man, this like doesn't jive with, like, it just made me angry, like how everything was in that society. And so I can see how somebody reading a Bible, especially perhaps if they haven't read it, and in comparison to other things, they may feel more in tune with in line with their soul and what their final purpose is. I think that deep down that, I mean, I could see how that would pull on people and make them feel different, compared to other things that they had read.
Yeah. And this professor, he says, I witnessed these men building their minds, grappling with ideas that are for them not merely abstract, but of the most immediate and ultimate concern. So he says they struggle with the implications of the choice to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, as if it's through their eyes, the choices they've made. Israel's unfaithfulness to the covenant, Job's discussion on justice and suffering. He says there is something palpably at stake in that classroom as these students confront the text with their own eyes through their own experiences.
That's so awesome. That's so cool. And that's great that they're comparing that to their own experiences. And those are some key biblical moments, I think, that would really speak to them and kind of make them think about things. I think that's awesome. I think also the idea of, just reading about the Bible itself is so probably some of the things that happen in the choices. I guess not maybe the choices, but you can see, especially the teachings of Jesus in the New Testament, you could see it's very radically different than what the life is that they're living, right? What is being said to be done, what we're called to. And so maybe that also has a level of attractiveness or uniqueness or something that's so different. Our brains do like things that are different, right? So having that in there, and teaching the Bible in that class may be something too that really draws them to it and challenges them, right? Gives them something new to look at, maybe hope. Change.
Sure,
something
absolutely.
different.
Yeah, and I think that's really the case for all of us, whether you're in prison or not. Sin is universal. So we've all fallen. We can all find the ways that we've fallen, the ways that we're not living up to these teachings of Christ. And so I think, in a way, what they're experiencing is the way that we will experience the Bible if we read it through fresh eyes, and if we allow ourselves to be open and to be challenged. It can also have that profound impact on us.
Yep, exactly. We haven't had the Bible for all that long, a few hundred years of human history, but it's been very impactful, and I think this is a great example of that.
Absolutely.
All right, that's it for this week on Heroic Media. Please join us next week for all the up-to-date news on the pro-life issues that matter to you.
Please feel free to write to us with any comments, questions, or news tips at news@heroicmedia.org.
And please visit our website at heroicmedianews.org, where you can check out more stories like the ones we discussed on this episode.
That's it for this week. Until next time, keep us in your prayers.
God bless.